Hello? Tonight, we open an old case file, one that has never rested in peace. I'm standing on the edge of the Giza plateau, not looking up at the majestic peaks of the pyramids against the twilight sky, but down towards a sprawling, dusty expanse of low-lying ruins just south of the Great Sphinx. This is the lost city of the pyramid builders, the workers' village, largely ignored by tourists, but holding secrets far more human and perhaps more harrowing than any golden sarcophagus. The wind carries the grit of millennia and the faint smell of excavations. Before me lies a reconstructed worker's bread mold, coarse and heavy, a single artifact representing millions of meals consumed in service of eternity. You might not want to be here when the truth surfaces from beneath these humble foundations. Before we continue, please like and subscribe only if you truly appreciate this kind of investigative storytelling. If you have a theory about who these builders really were, about the price they paid, share it in the comments. Dim the lights, bring your skepticism, and let's open the file. The common truth, a narrative actively correcting the Hollywood image of whip-driven slaves, is that the Great Pyramids of Giza were built not by enslaved masses, but by a skilled, organized workforce of Egyptian citizens. Evidence unearthed primarily by archaeologists like Mark Lenner over the past few decades points to a complex, state-run operation. These weren't just laborers, they were quarrymen, stonemasons, engineers, bakers, brewers, and doctors, conscripted on a rotational basis from across the kingdom. They lived in a purpose-built city, complete with barracks, bakeries that produced thousands of loaves daily, and cemeteries where they were buried with honor near the monuments they helped create. The graffiti left inside the pyramids often mentions specific work gangs with names like the Drunkards of Menkaure or the Friends of Khufu gang, suggesting a sense of camaraderie and pride, not forced servitude under threat of death. This revised history paints a picture of a national project, a collective effort fueled by religious devotion and civic duty. But buried just beneath this accepted narrative lies a strange and unsettling detail, revealed not by grand inscriptions, but by the sheer density and condition of the workers' cemetery adjacent to the village. While some were indeed buried with honor, the vast majority lie in simple pit graves, packed tightly together, their skeletons telling a different story. This is the lesser-known fact. Forensic analysis of these remains reveals a population ravaged by brutal labor. We see evidence of severe arthritis, spinal injuries consistent with moving immense weight, multiple healed fractures, and drastically shortened lifespans compared to the noble classes buried in mastabas nearby. Amputations were common, likely due to workplace accidents. While they received medical care, bones were set, limbs were removed surgically, the sheer volume of trauma speaks to the relentless, unforgiving nature of the work. They were fed, yes, primarily on bread and beer, a high-calorie diet essential for heavy labor, but often lacking in vital nutrients. This stark contrast between the honorable worker narrative and the brutal evidence etched into their bones ignites a fierce debate among Egyptologists. Was this truly a respected workforce, willingly sacrificing their bodies for their god, king, and a place in the afterlife, accepting the immense physical toll as part of their duty? Or was it a form of state-controlled corvée labor where refusal was not an option, and the honor was merely a thin veil over a system that consumed human lives on an industrial scale for architectural glory? Some argue the evidence points to a well-managed project where workers were valued. Others contend that the physical cost revealed in the bones cannot be ignored, suggesting a reality far harsher than the official narrative allows. The bread mold feels heavy in my hand. It represents sustenance, yes, but also the relentless fuel required for a machine that ran on human muscle. These weren't slaves, perhaps, but were they truly free? The answer might lie in the very sustenance they were given. The stark reality etched into the bones found in the workers' cemetery challenges the simple narrative of honored, willing participants. While they certainly weren't the Hollywood stereotype of slaves dying under the lash, the evidence suggests a life far removed from privilege or comfort. Our investigation now delves deeper into the organization of this massive workforce, examining the evidence for their compensation, health care, and the very nature of their employment. The common accepted truth, largely established through archaeological finds at the workers' village and textual references, is that these builders were indeed compensated. This wasn't chattel slavery. They received rations, primarily the bread and beer we've mentioned, but also fish, meat, mostly sheep and goat, and garlic, in quantities sufficient to fuel intense physical labor. Furthermore, evidence of sophisticated medical care exists. Remember the skeleton showing healed fractures and even amputations. This points to a dedicated medical team, likely priests of Sekhmet, the goddess of healing, who were skilled in treating the types of trauma expected on a massive construction site. Workers were buried in designated cemeteries, sometimes with simple grave goods like pottery, indicating a level of societal recognition beyond that afforded to slaves. But within this picture of a managed, compensated workforce, a strange detail emerges when we look at how they were compensated and organized. It wasn't a free labor market as we understand it. This is the lesser-known fact. The workforce operated under a system known as corvée labor. This was essentially a form of state-mandated rotational conscription. Villages across Egypt were required to send a quota of able-bodied men to work on state projects, pyramids, temples, canals, for a set period, perhaps a few months out of the year, particularly during the Nile's inundation season when agricultural work was impossible. While technically not slavery, refusal was likely met with severe consequences. Their payment in rations was less a wage and more a form of sustenance provided by the state to keep its conscripted labor force functioning. They were cogs in a massive state machine, replaceable and subject to the demands of the pharaoh's divine will. The graffiti mentioning work gangs, while suggesting camaraderie, could equally reflect the structured, almost military organization required to manage tens of thousands of conscripts. This distinction between paid labor and state-controlled corvée labor fuels a critical debate among historians. Was the corvée system a relatively benign form of national service, a way for Egyptians to contribute to projects they genuinely believed were crucial for maintaining cosmic order, Ma'at, and ensuring the pharaoh's successful transition to godhood? Or was it a brutal system of exploitation, barely distinguishable from slavery in its practical effects, where peasants were forcibly removed from their homes and subjected to dangerous, life-shortening labor under harsh conditions? Some argue that the religious devotion and the provision of food and care demonstrate a system based on mutual obligation, however unequal. Others emphasize the lack of choice, the grueling nature of the work evidenced by the skeletal remains, and the immense power disparity between the state and the individual worker, suggesting it was coercion disguised as piety. Remember the worker's bread mold? It symbolizes not just food, but perhaps the bare minimum required to extract maximum labor before the next rotation arrived. These workers built eternity for their pharaohs, but their own lives were often brutally short and consumed by the project. The very fuel that kept them going, that bread and beer, holds another layer of this harsh reality. The pyramid builders, conscripted under the corvée system, were fueled by the state. Their compensation wasn't primarily coin, but calories. Our investigation now shifts focus to the very sustenance that powered this monumental undertaking, the ubiquitous bread and beer diet. The common accepted truth, supported by extensive archaeological evidence from the workers' village, is the staggering scale of food production at Giza. Specialized bakeries and breweries operated around the clock. Excavations have unearthed large bakeries with dozens of bread molds, bedja, capable of producing thousands of standardized conical loaves daily. Similarly, remnants of large vats indicate breweries producing vast quantities of thick, nutritious, low-alcohol beer, a staple that was safer to drink than potentially contaminated Nile water and provided essential carbohydrates and B vitamins. This system ensured a consistent, high-energy food supply for a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands. The state wasn't starving its laborers, it was fueling them like engines required for a massive task. But within this picture of organized provisioning, a strange and less palatable detail emerges when we analyze the quality, not just the quantity, of this diet. While undeniably high in calories, the bread and beer staple was nutritionally monotonous. This is the lesser-known fact. Skeletal analyses from the workers' cemetery reveal widespread health issues directly linked to dietary deficiencies, despite the caloric surplus. The bread itself, made from emmer wheat ground with stone tools, was incredibly coarse and abrasive. It contained significant amounts of sand and grit, leading to extreme tooth wear, abscesses, and widespread dental disease, which could be excruciatingly painful and even lead to fatal infections. While analysis shows they occasionally received meat, primarily sheep, goat, and fish, and some vegetables like onions and garlic. Known for their potential health benefits, these were likely supplementary, not the core diet. Evidence for widespread consumption of fruits or a wider variety of vitamin-rich greens is scarce compared to the overwhelming evidence for bread and beer production. Signs of iron deficiency anemia have also been noted in some skeletal remains, suggesting the diet, while energy-rich, lacked sufficient iron and other micronutrients essential for long-term health. This nutritional imbalance raises a critical debate regarding the state's approach to its workforce. Was the bread and beer diet simply the most pragmatic and efficient way to feed an army of laborers using the readily available agricultural surplus of the Nile Valley, providing the raw energy needed for hauling massive stones? Or was it a reflection of the workers' perceived value, a basic, cost-effective fuel source designed for short-term output, contributing to their poor health and ultimately shorter lifespans, fitting the model of a rotational, expendable workforce? Some historians argue that the state did its best within the logistical constraints of the time, providing a diet that was considered wholesome by ancient standards. Others contend that the elite classes enjoyed a far more varied and nutritious diet, and the stark difference highlights the social hierarchy and the state's prioritization of the project over the long-term well-being of its individual builders. Remember the bread mold? It wasn't just a baking tool. It was a symbol of state control, portioning out the precise energy required, but perhaps little else. This relentless, abrasive, and nutritionally limited diet, combined with the back-breaking labor, left indelible marks not just on their health, but directly on their bones. The fuel provided, the coarse, gritty bread, and the ubiquitous beer painted a grim picture of the pyramid builders' daily sustenance, hinting at nutritional deficiencies despite the high caloric intake. But the most direct, irrefutable evidence of their harsh lives comes not from food remains or administrative texts, but from their own bodies. Our investigation now turns to the silent testimony of the skeletons unearthed from the workers' cemeteries at Giza. The common, accepted truth, established through decades of careful excavation and paleopathological analysis by experts like Zahi Hawass and his team, is the sheer volume of human remains found. Thousands of individuals were buried in the shadow of the pyramids, providing an unprecedented statistical sample for understanding the health and mortality of an ancient working-class population. These cemeteries are distinct from the elite mastabas, revealing the social stratification even in death. Within this vast skeletal archive, a strange and consistent pattern of trauma emerges, painting a vivid picture of the physical toll demanded by pyramid construction. This is the lesser-known fact, often starker than general descriptions allow. The types of injuries observed are overwhelmingly related to extreme physical labor and accidental trauma. Analysis reveals an exceptionally high rate of spinal pathologies, including degenerative arthritis and herniated discs, almost certainly caused by the immense strain of hauling and lifting multi-ton stone blocks. Healed fractures of limbs, particularly arms and legs, are commonplace, suggesting frequent accidents involving falling stones or collapsing ramps. Crushed fingers and toes are also frequently observed. Perhaps most telling is the evidence of amputations. Several skeletons show limbs surgically removed, often cleanly, indicating the presence of skilled doctors attempting to save lives after catastrophic injuries. While this medical intervention is impressive, the very need for such frequent, drastic procedures underscores the inherent danger of the work environment. The skeletal evidence fuels one of the most poignant debates surrounding the pyramid builders. We know they received medical care, sometimes quite sophisticated care for the era. But did this care reflect a genuine valuing of the workers as individuals, an investment in maintaining a skilled labor force? Or was it merely a pragmatic necessity, a form of damage control aimed at getting injured workers back on the Giza Plateau as quickly as possible, or at least preventing widespread disease that could halt the project? Some researchers emphasize the skill involved in the surgeries and bone setting, arguing it demonstrates a level of concern beyond mere utility. They point to evidence that even workers with debilitating long-term injuries were still cared for and buried within the community cemetery, suggesting they weren't simply discarded when no longer productive. Others, however, focus on the overall mortality rates and the sheer prevalence of trauma, arguing that the medical care, while present, was likely overwhelmed and primarily focused on immediate, life-saving interventions rather than long-term health or pain management. The average age at death for these workers appears to be significantly lower than that of the Egyptian elite, hovering perhaps in the early to mid-30s for men. Remember the nutritional deficiencies suggested by the bread and beer diet, combined with the relentless physical stress revealed by their bones. It paints a picture of lives burned out quickly in service to the pharaoh's eternal monument. Their skeletons are the final, undeniable receipts for the cost of building the pyramids. The skeletons bear witness to the brutal physical toll, while the diet analysis suggests a workforce fueled primarily for output, not longevity. But what did a typical day actually entail? How did tens of thousands of individuals, organized into gangs, coordinate their efforts to move millions of tons of stone under the relentless Egyptian sun? Our investigation now attempts to reconstruct a day in the life on the Giza Plateau, piecing together evidence from tomb reliefs, archaeological finds, and experimental archaeology. The common, accepted truth is that the construction involved two main types of stone: softer limestone quarried locally on the Giza Plateau itself for the bulk of the pyramid core, and harder, more valuable granite transported hundreds of miles south from Aswan for inner chambers and casing stones, along with fine white limestone from Tura for the outer casing. Huge teams of workers would quarry the blocks using copper chisels, hardened perhaps by arsenic, and wooden wedges swelled with water. Then came the monumental task of transport. Reliefs depict massive statues being pulled on wooden sledges by hundreds of men, often with water poured on the sand in front to reduce friction. It's assumed a similar system, possibly combined with ramps, was used for the pyramid blocks. But the precise logistics, especially the timing and intensity of the work, remain shrouded in mystery, and this is where strange details emerge from closer examination. Estimates of the total workforce vary wildly, from 20,000 to over 100,000, likely fluctuating seasonally. Work almost certainly happened in shifts. This is a lesser-known fact inferred from the sheer scale of the operation and the limited daylight hours. Reliefs depicting nighttime work under torchlight, while rare, do exist, suggesting construction might have continued around the clock during peak phases. A typical workday, however, likely lasted from sunrise to sunset, possibly 10 to 12 hours, with breaks dictated by the heat and the foreman's whistle. Experimental archaeology attempts, like those conducted by Mark Lehner's team or engineer Peter James, have shown that while moving multi-ton blocks is feasible with ancient techniques, it requires incredible coordination, immense manpower, and is agonizingly slow and dangerous. The ramps themselves are a huge point of contention. Were they long, straight external ramps? Internal ramps spiraling within the pyramid? Zigzagging ramps on one face? Each theory presents logistical challenges. This uncertainty fuels the enduring debate about the builder's daily reality. Was it a scene of highly organized, almost rhythmic labor, with skilled teams working in efficient synergy, buoyed by camaraderie and shared purpose, perhaps even chanting work songs as depicted in some tomb scenes? Or was it a chaotic, brutal grind under the constant threat of injury or death, supervised by harsh overseers enforcing relentless quotas, where exhaustion and despair were the norm. Some reconstructions emphasize the Egyptians' known organizational prowess, suggesting a well-oiled machine where every worker knew their role. Others focus on the sheer physical impossibility suggested by some calculations, e.g., placing one massive block every few minutes for decades, arguing that the conditions must have been far more brutal than often portrayed, perhaps involving techniques or levels of coercion we haven't fully grasped. Remember the skeletal evidence of crushed limbs and spinal damage? That wasn't the result of careful, well-managed labor. It was the result of repetitive extreme strain and sudden catastrophic accidents inherent in wrestling multi-ton stones up precarious ramps under immense pressure. A 12-hour shift under the Egyptian sun, hauling ropes slick with sweat and Nile water, maneuvering blocks that could crush a man in an instant. This was their reality. And sometimes the pressure became too much to bear. 12 hours under the sun, wrestling multi-ton blocks up precarious ramps, fueled by gritty bread and beer, while bearing the constant risk of catastrophic injury. This was the reconstructed reality of a pyramid builder's day. The pressure, both physical and psychological, must have been immense. Our investigation now probes a crucial question. Did these workers endure such conditions in stoic silence? Or did they ever push back? The common accepted truth portrays ancient Egypt as a rigidly hierarchical theocracy, where the pharaoh was a living god and dissent was unthinkable, likely met with swift and brutal suppression. The entire state apparatus was theoretically governed by the principle of Mayat, cosmic order, truth, and justice, which dictated that everyone, from the pharaoh down to the humblest laborer, fulfill their assigned role to maintain the balance of the universe. Open defiance against a state project ordained by a god-king seems, within this framework, almost sacrilegious, an invitation to chaos. But history often hides whispers of resistance in unexpected places, challenging the image of absolute compliance. Here lies a strange and electrifying detail, preserved on a fragile papyrus scroll now housed in Turin, Italy, known simply as the Turin Strike Papyrus, dating to the reign of Ramesses III, around 1159 BCE, centuries after the Giza pyramids, but offering invaluable insight into state labor practices. It documents something truly astonishing. This is the lesser-known fact. The papyrus meticulously records the world's first known labor strikes. The workers involved were not the pyramid builders of Giza, but the highly skilled artisans and craftsmen living in the purpose-built village of Deir el-Medina, responsible for constructing and decorating the lavish royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Despite enjoying a relatively privileged status compared to the Giza conscripts, receiving better rations and housing, the papyrus details their repeated, organized protests over severely delayed payments of grain. Their recorded complaints, transcribed by a contemporary scribe, are visceral and desperate. We are hungry. We are thirsty. The prospect of hunger and thirst has driven us to this. They didn't just grumble. They acted collectively. They organized sit-down strikes near the necropolis guard posts, refusing to work, loudly chanting their grievances, effectively halting progress on the pharaoh's eternal resting place. Remarkably, the papyrus shows that officials, including the vizier himself, eventually had to negotiate, providing at least partial payment of the overdue rations to quell the unrest and get the men back to work. This unique document ignites a fascinating debate among historians about the nature of power and labor in ancient Egypt. Does the Turin Strike Papyrus indicate a surprising level of worker agency and collective bargaining power, suggesting that even under divine rule, laborers could organize, voice dissent, and compel the state to respond? Or was this an exceptional case, an anomaly tolerated only because the Deir el-Medina artisans possessed irreplaceable artistic and engineering skills crucial for the pharaoh's successful journey into the afterlife? A leniency that would never have been extended to the less specialized, more easily replaceable corvée workforce at Giza. Some scholars argue that it reveals a fundamental Egyptian belief that Ma'at applied even to the state's obligations towards its workers, that providing sustenance was a divine duty, and failing to do so disrupted cosmic order, thus forcing the officials to act. Others contend it was pure pragmatism. Losing the tomb builders would jeopardize the pharaoh's eternity, a far greater concern than the temporary dissatisfaction of thousands of Giza stone haulers. Remember the grueling conditions and high injury rates among the Giza builders evidenced by their bones? If the skilled, valued artisans of Deir el-Medina were driven to strike over delayed food, imagine the potential desperation and simmering resentment among the Giza conscripts facing far greater daily dangers and hardships. While no Giza Strike Papyrus has ever been found, perhaps because such dissent was brutally suppressed or simply because records didn't survive, the Turin document proves that resistance wasn't unthinkable. It forces us to consider the possibility of similar, perhaps less successful struggles for basic survival occurring even at the foot of the Great Pyramids themselves. The finality of the pyramids belies the very human tensions that likely simmered beneath their rising slopes. The possibility of resistance, even if only documented centuries later among the tomb artisans, adds another layer of humanity to the Giza plateau. It forces us to see the builders not just as cogs in a state machine, but as individuals capable of experiencing desperation and demanding dignity. Our investigation, which began in the dusty ruins of their forgotten city, has led us through the evidence of their labor system, their meager diet, the trauma etched into their very bones, and the potential whispers of defiance. Now, standing metaphorically at the foot of the finished Great Pyramid, it is time to assemble the final pieces of this case file and confront the dual legacy of this ancient wonder. The common, accepted truth is undeniable. The pyramids of Giza are among the most awe-inspiring achievements in human history. They are masterpieces of engineering, testaments to organizational genius, and enduring symbols of a civilization that profoundly shaped our world. For millennia, they have stood against the desert winds, embodying eternity, divine power, and the monumental ambition of the pharaohs they housed. They represent the pinnacle of Old Kingdom Egypt, a society capable of mobilizing immense resources to create structures that still defy easy explanation. But, as our investigation has revealed, this glorious facade was built upon a foundation far removed from divine serenity. The strange, enduring detail that emerges from the cumulative evidence, the crowded cemeteries, the worn teeth, the fractured spines, the high mortality rates, is the stark contrast between the monument's intended eternity and the brutally short, expendable lives of those who built it. This is the lesser-known fact that haunts the legacy of Giza, The pyramids stand not just as symbols of pharaonic power, but also as silent memorials to the tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of ordinary Egyptians whose bodies were consumed in their construction. They were not slaves whipped into submission, but neither were they entirely free volunteers participating in a joyous national project. They were conscripts bound by duty and likely coercion, fueled by a basic diet that kept them working but contributed to their ill health, and subjected to perilous labor that left undeniable scars on their skeletons. The medical care they received speaks less of compassion and more of pragmatic workforce maintenance. This brings us to the final unsettling debate that defines the legacy of the pyramid builders. How do we reconcile the breathtaking achievement of the monuments with the immense human cost required to erect them? Was the price paid by these workers, their health, their shortened lives, their grueling labor, a justifiable sacrifice for the creation of something timeless, something that served a profound religious and societal purpose in their worldview? Or must we view the pyramids, at least in part, as monuments built on systemic exploitation, where the divine ambition of a few demanded the physical destruction of many? Some argue that we cannot impose modern values on an ancient society, that the builders likely shared the pharaoh's belief in the necessity of these structures for maintaining cosmic order. Others insist that suffering is universal, and the evidence of broken bodies and early deaths cannot be simply contextualized away as part of the times. Remember the workers' village, the lost city? It represents both the incredible organization behind the project and the disposable nature of the lives lived within it. The pyramids embody this duality, a breathtaking quest for eternity built by those whose own time was often cut brutally short. This case file on the Giza builders closes not with a simple answer, but with the heavy weight of that paradox. As the sun sets over the Giza plateau, casting long shadows that mimic the shape of the pyramids themselves, the ruins of the workers' village fall into deeper darkness. The case file is closed, but the echoes remain. The pyramids stand, immutable and iconic, attracting millions who marvel at their scale and mystery. Yet, just beneath the surface lies the story we've unearthed, a story etched in bone, buried in sand, whispered in the records of rations and resistance. The builders of Giza were not the nameless, faceless slaves of cinematic myth, but they were also far from the romanticized image of pious volunteers. They were real people, caught in the gears of a powerful state, driven by a complex mix of duty, coercion, faith, and the simple need to survive. Their legacy forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about many of humanity's greatest achievements. They often carry a hidden human cost. The magnificence we admire from a distance was frequently forged in crucibles of hardship we prefer not to see. The story of the pyramid builders reminds us that history is not just about kings and monuments. It's about the countless ordinary lives spent, often broken, in their creation. It asks us to look beyond the glittering surface, to listen for the voices silenced by time and buried beneath the weight of glory. And perhaps it leaves us with one final lingering question. As we build our own modern pyramids, our technological wonders, our global economies, our complex societies, who are the unseen builders today? What stories do their bodies tell? And centuries from now, What truths will future investigators unearth from the overlooked ruins of our own time, our own time, our own time, our own